Day after day, we hear more news reporting the collapse of our supply chain, from lockdowns disrupting the flow of goods across the globe to skyrocketing freight rates and a persistent shortage of shipping containers. From severe congestion at our key ports to a lack of enough dock workers, warehouse staff and truck drivers to make all of those goods reach your local stores. In recent weeks, Americans have been resorting to social media to complain about increasingly bare shelves as the latest surge of infections leaves the already tight labor market even tighter. The truth is that our supply chain is the perfect representation of our economy, because the supply chain is essentially the economy. Every single step in the production, processing, and distribution of a product requires resources, personnel, and logistics, and when the supply chain starts to break down, so does the economy. That's what the economist, financial strategist, and commentator James Rickards has detailed in a recent analysis published in the Daily Reckoning. The term supply chain comprehends an intricate system of manufacturing, processing, transportation, packaging, marketing, advertising, customer relations, vendor and supplier relations, and of course, capital. The main element that provides support to the relation between the supply and demand of every single physical, digital, intellectual, or artistic artifact in the entire world. The supply chain is everywhere, as explains Rickards. To illustrate the complexity and extensiveness of supply chains, the analyst cites an experiment suggested by MIT scholar Yossi Sheffi in his book, The Resilient Enterprise, in which you consider yourself as a one-person supply chain to understand how rooted these dynamics are in our daily lives. Sheffi highlights that supply chain processes are hidden in every single thing we buy and consume. For instance, when you wake up in the morning to the sound of your alarm clock, that object may have been purchased at a big retail store and made in China. Then you get out of bed, make yourself a nice cup of coffee that's been produced in Brazil or Costa Rica. You make breakfast using eggs that have been trucked from a local farm, make some toast using bread from a local bakery, pour some orange juice that's been moved in refrigerated rail cars all the way from Florida to your local store. After you've done with that, you go check your email and news using a computer that's made in China. Then it's time to hop in your car, made in Tennessee by a Japanese company, and take a trip to the mall. You purchase some clothes, probably made in Thailand or Vietnam, pick up your new eyeglasses at the optometrist with German lenses and Italian frames. On the way back home, you fill up your car with gasoline that's been refined in Philadelphia from oil that was pumped in Nigeria, shipped to the refinery by tanker, and delivered by truck to your local gas station. And that goes on and on. We're all surrounded by goods sourced from all over the planet and then delivered by truck, rail, or vessel to local distribution and processing centers, which will then forward those goods to our nearby stores. The consumer represents what is known as the last mile delivery in the supply chain, since they shop using their own vehicles or they pay to have goods delivered to their door through e-commerce vendors like Amazon. In sum, the consumer is at the very center of their own human supply chain. We can have an even better notion of the global complexity required to make these processes work when we consider what's called the extended supply chain. In this experiment, we take all of the supplies in our personal supply chains and consider the separate supply chains of each of those suppliers. For example, the alarm clock that woke you up, made in China, has parts from suppliers from all over the world, which include semiconductors, copper cords, plastic moldings, LED displays, and more. Meanwhile, our morning coffee is made in a percolator or drip-style coffee maker produced with stainless steel, tempered glass, semiconductors, and other components from suppliers in Germany, Taiwan, and Mexico. The coffee beans were planted, harvested, roasted, processed, and packaged abroad, loaded into shipping containers, and delivered by cargo ships owned and operated by Maersk from Denmark, COSCO from China, or Hapag-Lloyd from Germany. The ships themselves were probably built in Korea, while containers were manufactured in China. Although the vehicle you used to go shopping may have been made in Tennessee, it includes semiconductors from Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing. The clothes you bought were made from cotton grown in Egypt and included plastic buttons produced in Malaysia. These operations are so entangled that we can continue this analysis indefinitely. The plastic resins needed to produce that button in the Malaysian factory may have come from a chemical enterprise in Germany. You got the idea. The supply chain is virtually endless because every single output has one or more inputs, which have their own inputs all the way back to basic industries such as mining and steel foundries, Rickards describes. On top of that, all of those industries have their own inputs of machinery and electricity. Making it all work is human capital, from technical expertise to manual labor. The supply chain never ends, he continues. Thus, the collapse of global supply chains can be attributed to two different factors: efficiency and energy. Of course, efficiency is the optimal, desirable outcome in this chain of processes. It means that producers, distributors, and retailers will be able to reduce costs and lower prices for consumers. On the other hand, energy is essential to keep the entire system running. Each step requires some sort of energy. Even though energy supplies may be scattered in some regions of the planet, it appears to be plentiful on a global basis. So, how can these two elements be blamed for the supply chain breakdown? That's the paradox of complex dynamic systems analysis, notes Rickards. The global supply chain is one of the most complex systems ever created, he adds, arguing that in order to understand this paradox, we should analyze each of these factors separately. Let's start with efficiency. The modern version of supply chain management began in the 1980s as globalization and the growth in technology combined to make supply chains more complex and also offer tools to manage that complexity. Supply chain management lowers costs by creating options, sharing information, eliminating redundancies, encouraging cooperation among supply chain participants, and other innovations. But when you increase the length of a supply chain to reach lower labor costs in Asia, for example, you also increase the number of things that can go wrong along the way, the analyst writes. That's to say, for example, if you have a company and you want to lower costs for your customers by reducing your trucking providers to the two that offer the lowest rates, well, you're actually increasing your vulnerability to disruptions. If one of these providers suffers a strike or is hit by a natural disaster, you probably won't get your deliveries in time. If you route all of your inboard cargo to the Port of Los Angeles instead of Houston, New York City, or Tacoma, in order to be close to your distribution center, what happens when the Port of Los Angeles becomes a global bottleneck, which it has, asks Rickards. In other words, the hidden cost of efficiency is vulnerability, which leads us to the second issue, energy. Intricate and dynamic systems such as the supply chain require a huge amount of energy to function. The big problem is that the global energy input rises in relation to the scale of the system. In simple terms, this means that if you double the scale of a system, you'll probably need a lot more energy to run, which includes electricity, capital, and labor. According to the analyst estimates, you'll need 5 times more energy in such a scenario, and if you double it one more time, you increase the energy inputs by a factor of 5 again. This means that after doubling the scale of the system twice, the scale is 4 times larger. But the energy inputs are 25 times larger, he explains. So, when profits from expanding the scale of the system are high and energy costs are low, these lopsided ratios of scaling functions may still be profitable on net, but when profits start to decline and energy prices surge, the consequences of higher energy input costs on an extremely stretched supply chain network are translated into major disruptions to the operation of the system as a whole. As we're witnessing happening in China and some European countries, the rising cost of energy supplies can trigger widespread energy shortages which hamper production and logistics. China is currently facing severe coal shortages as the government pushes its green energy agenda. But still, coal accounts for over 50% of China's electricity generating capacity. On the other hand, Germany is going through extensive natural gas shortages, which are likely to get worse in case Russia begins a conflict with Ukraine and the US imposes sanctions on Russia. These energy shortages are slowing down production and global growth right now. Other factors currently weighing on the supply chain are the health crisis and rising geopolitical tensions. Global superpowers such as Australia and China are trying to eradicate the virus even as the rest of the world faces a new outbreak. That seems quite impossible. It's almost the same as pursuing a policy in which no one catches a cold. They want a utopia, but the price to pay is very real. In America, our leaders' policies have ended up creating even worse congestion at ports and led to painful fines for companies that weren't able to move their containers due to a lack of workers. The worker shortage, however, can be attributed to our government's lack of competence in creating a safe environment for workers to stay at their posts during the sanitary outbreak with fair pay. All of those increased costs are being passed on to consumers who've been dealing with the sharpest inflation spike in almost 4 decades. Given today's outlook, supply chains must be restructured. But as Rickards warned, reconfiguring the supply chain will take 5 to 10 years to accomplish. In the meantime, you should expect empty shelves, higher costs, and slower growth in companies most affected by the breakdown.